I've never built anything with Honey Locust before, and today we're going to change that. So there's a story behind this board, and it goes like this. About 4 months ago or so, the last time was visiting the lumberyard that I like, which is about an hour outside of town. And I was stocking up mostly on cherry and a bit of walnut. And I get to chatting with the guy, and he's talkative, and he pulls out this board, and he shows it to me. And, I'll bring you in close in a moment, but it's got so many pinks in it. And he told me this is Honey Locust. And I've never seen Honey Locust before. I've never used Honey Locust, and he actually wasn't really sure what to do that much with Honey Locust either. It's not really common. It's not something he sees a lot in his lumber operation. Black locust he sees a fair bit more, and he said black locust is great for hardwood floor. He's done that before. But anyways, as we were chatting, he just tossed this on the stack with the rest of my purchase and said, "Here, go make something with it." And it's been sitting in my shop for ever since, and I've only got the one board, so I want to make something that features it, but also I want to, I've never used it before, so it's a learning experience for me. This board is just a hair over 10 feet long and 4 inches wide, so it's only about 3.3 board feet, so it's not a lot of wood to work with. Also, like I said, I've never worked with it before, and I think the color is going to be striking and interesting, but I don't even know what it's going to look like with finish on it at this point. So it seems to me that a shop project is the smart move here. Build something that is just for me as an experiment, a learning experience, and not a project for somebody else. And so I was looking around the shop trying to figure out what I could do with it. Do I need another tool holder or something? And I decided to make a cabinet door. This is my charging cabinet. I've got all my battery chargers and what in there, and it's just a plain old blue painted piece of particle board. So I'm gonna just make myself a cabinet door. It should be a pretty quick and straightforward project, but it's still gonna have me go through all the steps in processing wood: planing, jointing, dimensioning, assembling. So I'll try it all out and get to see how it is with this lumber. And in the end, it's going to be something that I'm going to be seeing every time I'm in the shop. So I'll get to see how it ages with the finish and that sort of thing. As I mentioned earlier, there's this white or very light yellow color. And then there's this pinkish, reddish, orangey color. And yeah, do I want to, I could conceivably just feature the pink entirely. Or I could do some sort of a mix of, if I use this side of the board of the white along with the pink and red. And I've been sort of debating that. With a cabinet door, you've got the panel, you've got the rails and the stiles. So there's sort of 4 different parts to it, if you will. And I thought about doing the rails and the stiles in white, and then the sort of the reddish pink in the middle, or vice versa, or something else. And yeah, that's one of those situations where you're just sort of standing, scratching your head, trying to decide which one's going to look better. And since it's the first time I've ever used this wood, I don't know what it's going to look like with finish on it. So you just got to pick one. So since it's an experiment, I think I'm going to try something that's a little bit out there. So I don't want to hide the white or the red. Obviously, you can't hide the red. There's so much of it. But most definitely, I don't want to hide the white. In fact, I want to feature it somehow. So what I think I'm going to do down here at this end of the board, where you got the white on one side and the pink in the other, I'm going to put the board like this. And I'm going to cut this into a whole bunch of strips and then glue them together so that I will get pink and white stripes. And that's going to be my panel. And then the rails and stiles are just going to be solid pink or orange or red or whatever it is. So I first cut the 2 pieces for the panel because I think that's the most critical piece. I have enough, but not a whole lot extra to make the panel that I need. So I want to get this done first. So I'm going to take it over to the jointer and joint it and then plane it just as much as I need to so that I can rip it down and glue it up in strips. So after planing, here's the pink side, and it is still very pink, but you You also see yellowy bits showing through, and here's some darker bits showing through, but now the white side is really interesting because like at this end of the board, it's actually looking rather brown, and here it's looking quite yellow. So I think we are definitely sort of in the, I'm guessing it's in the transition towards the bark or something, or more likely the transition between the heartwood and the sapwood. I don't know, or it's just, or there's just variations in the tree, who knows. So now I want to take these boards, rip them into strips, and then turn them on their sides like this so we can see the red and white stripes. So I'm going to put in my glue line ripping blade to make sure I get the cleanest possible cut. So as I was pushing it through the table saw, I could definitely tell that it was harder than I was expecting. I had to be fairly slow as I was pushing the wood through the saw. So one second, I want to look them up online. So I'm no expert, but according to a 10-second search on Google, Honey Locust is like a 1500 or so on the Janka hardness scale. And compare that to hard maple, which is like 1450. And cherry and black walnut are down around 1000. So yeah, I work a lot with cherry and somewhat with walnut. This is definitely harder than cherry. So each board gave me 5 strips plus a 6 that is just a little bit thinner. And I'm going to take these and I'm just going to flip them and book match each one so that the white is matching up to the white. Oh, we'll get all these strips of white. Here it's kind of hard to see because there's some burning, but definitely here I can see the white. And I need just a little bit more thickness, so I'm going to put these on the outside, and that gives me a panel that should be plenty wide for what I need. So now I want to glue it up and keep it as flat as possible. Luckily, the wood did not move much when I was jointing it, so this is staying fairly flat here, which is great because I don't have a whole lot of extra thickness to work with. So far it's matching my vision, which is great, so now let's let this dry and then proceed. The next day I took it out of clamps and also had a bit of a mic failure, so the audio is missing on a few of these clips. I started with 5/8 inch thick boards and I didn't want to lose too much of that, so I planed it as little as possible, just enough to flatten the panel. And I ended up with something about a 1/2 inch thick. So here's the finished panel, and you can just see all the stripes, which is what I was hoping for. It's looking really cool. Let me spread some water on here and we can sort of get a look at what it'll be with some finish on it. I think it's still going to be fairly pale and light, but we'll see how it ages, of course, too. I was sort of hoping for the white stripes to be maybe a little bit more prominent. I think they are on the flip side. Yeah, here there's some really wide stripes here, but unfortunately there's this rather large knot on the back, so like this is going to be the back side. There's also a knot here on the front, but I've measured and I'm sure that I'll be able to cut it out so that this will be the panel of the door. So I can put this aside for now and we'll work on the rails and stiles of the door next. So then it was back to the joiner with the remaining bit of rough Honey Locust that I had. And after that, I took it to the planer where I planed it down to a bit over 3/4 of an inch in thickness. I was doing my best to plane away these flaws in the board, but unfortunately I couldn't. And as this is about all I've got left of Honey Locust, I don't have any more, so I'm gonna have to use that board. On the positive side, the cracks don't go all the way through, so it'll still look good on the front. It's just the cracks are gonna be visible on the back. But I'm gonna stop now and add some 5-minute epoxy, as I don't want these cracks opening up during the rest of the build process. And it looks like my 5-minute epoxy has gone bad. It's gotten, that has gone thick. I do not trust it anymore. Fortunately, I have some slower acting epoxy, but that means I'm basically done for the next 24 hours. The nice thing about 5-minute epoxy is that you can do a much smaller amount. This is way more than I'm sure I need. One thing I like to do is heat the wood up, make it warm so that the epoxy will go down deep into the crack. That's less critical with this epoxy, but with the 5-minute, I find it really helps. Yeah, I think that's all I'm going to need. And that's it till tomorrow, I guess. So here's what it looks like after the epoxy is dried. This crack is nicely filled in, and I put some super glue along this side, so hopefully this will hold together as we proceed with further processing, but I will hit it with a bit of sanding first. And after that, I could rip my piece down to the 2-inch final width of my rails and stiles. After ripping it to width, I then cut out the 4 pieces that I need for the rails and stiles, along with 1 spare. And when all is said and done, this is all I've got left for scrap from the original board that I started with. Other than a few little pieces that have been ripped off to the side. And I've already used this one for setting up the saw for my next cut. I'm glad I have this piece, so when I can do some finish testing later, I will have both red and white that I can use for finish testing. This is a raised panel door, so I'm going to make stub tenons, so I've set up the table saw so that I can cut a groove down the center. And the way I will do that is I will first run the board along the saw, and then I will flip it end for end and run the board again. And since I have a full kerf blade in there, that should give me a notch that is just about a 1/4 inch wide. But more important than that, because I'm flipping the board end for end, it will be perfectly centered. I then set the saw blade height carefully in a stop block, and I ran some test tenons. Now I'm ready to cut the actual tenons on my good pieces. And I'm just using a skinny blade, so I will just be doing repeated cuts on the table saw. So mistakes were made. As I'm cutting the very first stub tenon on one of my good pieces, one of my precious few pieces, I realized I'd screwed up big time. I'm so used to using dowels in my joinery, I totally forgot to allow for the stub tenon when cutting my pieces to length, which means they are too short by about 1 inch, because the stub tenons are a 1/2 inch each. So I really should have made these another inch longer. And I turned off the saw and I spent a lot of time thinking and looking around, and we're getting back to the problem that I only had that one board. I just don't have any other pieces. This is a good time to leave the shop, but I need to get a few more things glued up before I do that. New day, and I've got a solution. If you recall, after I cut everything out, I said I only had like 3 pieces of scrap. Well, it just so happens that one of them is longer than 10 inches, which is what I need. Here's that scrap piece. It had some sapwood on this side, but this side is clean. And as you can see, I was using it for test cutting tenons, but luckily there is still 10 inches of length, so I can cut it to match the one piece. I don't like the grain on this piece as much as I did on the other two, but what else can you do? I actually had tried repairing the piece that I'd cut too short. So that piece had a stub tenon like this, and so I cut a notch on the end of one of my scraps, and I had a pretty good grain match. So like, it wouldn't have been the end of the world, but it still would have bugged me. So I'm glad I don't have to do that. So I've got my 2 rails, but they're still lacking in tenons, so I'll be switching gears and using dowels to join these to the stiles. This does mean that I'm going to need to fill this notch in at the end of the stile, and oh, by the way, I looked it up, and the long ones are the stiles and the short ones are the rails, and I'll probably forget that before my next project. But anyways, last night before I closed up shop, I did cut and fit in some little blocks into the ends of all the stiles so we can move ahead. Little block plane work. We'll take this down flush, and then a little bit of sanding, and we're ready to start the doweling process. No surprise to longtime viewers, I'll be using the Dowel Max jig, but I've focused on dowels in a lot of other projects, so I'm going to skip through the whole doweling process. And a quick dry fit. And there's our door frame. Now let's do the panel. And we'll be very careful to measure twice or thrice and cut once, hopefully correctly. I set up a dado blade in my table saw so that I could cut a rabbet around all the sides of my panel. So I had to do a little bit of adjustment and rejigging, but I do believe, oops, that I now have a proper fitting door. Like that. Mainly, as you can see, I notched the corners a little bit to make it fit because they were just sort of hitting these little bits here. These are not perfectly in the right spot, but the good thing is nobody's going to see that because that gets buried in the corner like that when the door is together. And so now I can proceed with gluing up my door. Got everything laid out and double checked. So let's get the dowels into position and away we go. And in case you're curious, here's a close-up of one of the stiles where I've filled in the block and then we drilled the dowel holes out. In this situation, the dowels are providing most of the joinery, so I'm not really worrying about putting glue on this surface. And of course, no glue for the panel. That one dowel needed a bit of persuasion. And one door. And while I've got the door panel clamped up and drying, I'm going to do some finish testing on some of my few scraps that I have of the wood. Here I'm doing some de-waxed shellac. I'll probably put poly over it, but just... oh, that is so clear. And on the middle section, I'm going to be using some Danish oil. A little more amber, but... and finally over here, my old standby of the Minwax oil modified polyurethane. I usually brush this, but for just a little dab like this, I'm just going to use a rag. Oh, they look so identical to begin with. I was hoping that I could get the red to stand out more, but we'll see. I should try putting this in some sunlight and see if that makes any sort of a difference. So it's now the next day, not quite 24 hours, and I'm really glad that I did this test bit of finish here. And as I look at these three pieces, I think I like the Danish oil best for what I'm doing here. So this was the water-based oil-modified polyurethane. This was just shellac, and I've not done just one coat on all of them. But here, if we just look at this, it seems to me that it's just a little bit, getting a little bit more, say, rosy looking here on this piece. Just a comparison, here's bare wood. And then on this piece, this is definitely, I think, a bit more golden looking than the others. The oil modified poly is surprisingly flat. Normally the oil modified poly, like I use it on cherry all the time and it looks great. The oil modification part of the poly just gives it a bit of that warming up color. But so I'm gonna go with some Danish oil on this piece. But first a little first coat of finish, still wet, but it's a lovely, nice, warm honey gold tone. With Danish oil, I have to wait 30 minutes and then put on another coat. So while this is waiting, let's take a moment and just talk about my thoughts about Honey Locust as woodworking lumber. So first thing I would take note of is that it's hard. It's hard like hard maple. So, I mean, that's fine. You just need to be aware of that when you're pushing it through your table saw, that you're gonna slow it down a bit. Hard like hard maple, but it burnt like cherry, and it's got a wild grain, kind of like ash. It's got the same sort of pronounced look to the grain that ash does. So in a sense, it's kind of a combination, hard like maple, wild grain like ash, burns like cherry when you cut it. So yeah, the grain, let's talk a bit about aesthetics. Like this board that I had a pretty pronounced grain, but it also had a really, here's the raw side. It had a really cool color. I quite liked the sort of the reddish flecky with the yellow bits to it. I still think that's really interesting. I was kind of hoping it would become a little bit more darker, richer when I put the finish on, but my test pieces are pretty light, but then again, this has got some honey gold to it. So I'm fingers crossed. I'm really curious what it's going to look like, say, in 6 or 8 months. It's almost too bad that I'm hanging that here in my shop because we don't get really much UV in here. I'd be interested to take a piece and put it in front of, put it outside for a couple hours. It's wintertime, so I'm not putting this thing outside for a couple hours, but maybe in 6 months I might pin a comment down below that gives some thoughts about what it looks like after it's really aged for a while. So let's talk a bit more about machining. I already talked about it being hard, so you're pushing a bit slower through the saw, but it's impossible to get this on camera, but the initial cut surface I found has a little bit of texture to it. Like hard maple, if you have sharp tools, it comes out, like really glassy smooth. This still had just a little bit of texture to it. And yet, I went over it with some 150 grit and it completely smoothed out perfectly. So it smooths to a nice finish after you've sanded it. And I don't know if this was just bad luck, but I got like 3 or 4 tiny little splinters when I was working with the wood. So I think it's a little splintery. All of this take with a grain of salt because I've had experience with one board. One board from one lumberyard that was kiln dried and all that, but one board. So let's just wrap it all in that. I guess in summary, I'd say it's fine. If you like the aesthetics, it's a perfectly good wood to work with. I would happily work with it. But like I said, this is the first board of it I've ever seen, so I don't think it's really that common. So I don't know how much you're going to encounter it. But if you ever do, maybe take a chance on it, because yeah, this is looking cool so far. One more coat of finish and then it's time to hang it up. Just like that. I got nothing against the color blue, but this looks really sharp. I'm really glad I did it. In fact, once I got this up, I thought it looked so nice. I went digging through all the leftover scrap remnants and I used it to redo the face of this little shelf that I have here for my Bluetooth speaker, just fancying up the place a bit. I'm kind of glad that I left these bark inclusions here, you know, the flaws that I was talking about. It just adds for a little bit of interest here on the styles. And also these stripes. I'm really glad that I turned the board to make this red and white striping effect. I just think it makes the panel look really kind of interesting. And speaking of color, it's almost hard to believe that this was just from one board. I mean, you look at the golden color here of the style and then compare that to sort of the stripy red here. I mean, you know, ignore the sapwood because that was on the other side of it, but still, just you got these colors and they're just from the same board. It just has to do with how you present the board and how you oriented it. And that's my first look at Honey Locust. Maybe give it a try if you ever find it in the lumberyard and see what you think about it. But otherwise, that's it for this one. Thanks for stopping by. Hope you learned something. I know I did. See you later.